Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here with us tonight on a very special evening as we celebrate the brilliant British art historian Katy Hessel. Hi, Katy.
Hello.
We're so excited to have you here, in spite of the weather.
I'm sorry I brought it with me. It's terrible.
All the way from the UK. For those of you who don't know Katy, Katy is the author of The Story of Art Without Men, which is a Sunday Times and New York Times bestseller. Most recently, How to Live an Artful Life. And last but not least, with a premiere advanced copy of her first children's book, The Story of Art Without Men, an illustrated guide to amazing women artists. Katy also runs the Great Women Artists Instagram account. She writes a column for The Guardian. She hosts the Great Women Artists podcast and the second season of the series, Death of an Artist, devoted to the amazing Lee Krasner. Katy has lectured at the Guggenheim, the Museum of Fine Arts Boston, Tate, the National Gallery, the Courtauld, and she has curated exhibitions at the galleries Victoria Miro, Casmin, and Stephen Friedman. Last but not least, she runs the annual Great Women Artists Residency at Palazzo Monti in Brescia, Italy. How are you, Katy?
Oh my goodness, I'm so good. Thank you all so much for coming. I really thought like 4 people would come, and it's just such an honor to be here. Dalazine is my new favorite bookshop in the world, and I want to live here and buy everything. And honestly, just thank you, because I've never actually spoken in Miami before, so this is a real treat and honor. So thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for being here. We're thrilled to have you. As you can tell by this room full of brilliant artists and creatives and women who do jewelry and books and photographs and edit and self-publish books and women's book clubs, and every seat in the house is taken. The excuse couldn't be more perfect to have you here to speak about your new book, How to Live an Artful Life, 366 Inspirations from Artists on How to Bring Creativity to Your Everyday. What can you tell us about the format and the ethos behind this book?
So I have a podcast called the Great Women Artists Podcast, and I essentially just meet my heroes and interview them. I always say this to kids: if you want to meet your heroes, just start a podcast. Artists teach me so much, whether it's how to, look through a lens in the right way, or sort of capture a scene like Sally Mann, or paint a blue line like Alice Neal, or capture truth like Tracey Emin, or think about family, think about relationships, think about the world, think about nature, think about so many, greater things than us human beings. And after every single podcast interview, I always sort of take my time and go through the transcript and pick out different quotes and things that I've been taught by said artist, or maybe it's a scholar talking about an artist from history. We've got an episode of Elsa Schiaparelli, the designer, coming out tomorrow, and there's so much about her that teaches us about sort of astrological, teaches us about surrealism, collaboration with artists and designers, etc. And so I have this kind of insane archive of like hundreds of hours of interviews, and I was talking to my editor, and we wanted to make a book that celebrated this. It was 10 years of the Great Women Artists. I started it when I was 21 in 2015, and so we thought, instead of publishing interviews, we thought about publishing kind of bite-size sections from these interviews. And so what this book is, it is a quote by an artist or writer or a thinker or a maker or anything for every single day of the year. And it is made up of different themes and different chapters. So I love to sort of see the year as if it were a story or a clock or something. And I love New Year's. Obviously, it can happen at any time. It can be Chinese New Year. It can be anything, whatever. But there's something about January that is so exciting, the kind of anticipation and the unknown that we're about to delve in. It's almost like the sort of, on the back of this book, we say, a year, the year ahead is a gift that has been given to you. What will you do with it? And I kind of love this idea of the kind of expectation of it. So the quotes in January are all about new beginnings, how to start, getting into the right frame of mind. Sometimes that's harder than actually doing the work. February is all about love and passion, whether there's love of this thing called art that mesmerizes us in every single corner. I mean, we were talking today about how a love of art is endless. There is just so much more to explore. You were teaching me about artists today who I couldn't believe weren't in my ether. And that's the kind of brilliant thing, is you can go to different corners of the world and you can constantly learning. It never, ever gets boring. But also love about relationships, about self-love, about, love when people pass, months such as August is about beauty. This kind of strange, especially where I live in England, it's a strange, expansive month that no one really knows what to do with in a way. So it's kind of considering what beauty can mean in so many different capacities, whether it's, the writer Hisham Matar going to the National Gallery and saying, okay, well, pick out just one painting in the National Gallery and go see that for a week and notice how it changes as you go on with your month. And I think, you can learn so many things from artists about looking, about being, about noticing change. There's a quote from Rebecca Solnit saying, you have to be slower than change in order to see change. September's about time. Great quote starting off September, which is from Lina Bo Bardi, the brilliant architect, which talks about, linear time being this Western invention. And actually what the world is this marvelous entanglement. And it reminds us that everyone is on their own clocks. And the beauty of the world is the fact that everyone was born at a different moment. And the tree was planted at a different moment. And the building was built at a different moment. If it was all the same, it wouldn't be exciting. And that's what artists can teach us. They can take us out of these kind of quite bureaucratic systems sometimes that the world puts us in. And they can teach us to see the world anew. And I mean, I could go on for hours, but it's that. It's in a world where so many of us forget to look anymore. It reminds us how we can look at the world through the people who look at the world, I think, in the most well-rounded, brilliant way, which is artists.
And of course, it follows your blockbuster best-selling book, The Story of Art Without Men, which was published in 2022. For those of you who don't have a copy of this already, the book is a response to the exclusion and nearly erasure of women artists from Ernest Gombrich's Story of Art, which is a seminal canonical textbook in art history. So you went ahead and wrote a 500-page book devoted to women artists from the 16th to the 21st century. And it's been translated to 19 languages. I mean, it's an incredibly political work, right? Did you know when you were writing this book, which I believe is in the middle of the pandemic, that it was going to have the impact that it did?
I mean, I'm delighted that you think that it has had an impact. That's so wonderful. And, I come to places like Miami where I once came as a child and I can't believe people know about it. It's amazing. I think that, with my work and with the work of so many people who are contributing to this sort of the new canons, the new stories, I think people are hungry for these subjects. We go to museums to learn. When I was younger, the reason why I started my Instagram, The Great Woman Artist, was because I went to an art fair when I was 21. I looked at the artwork in front of me and realized I didn't see a single artwork by a woman artist. And then I questioned myself, can I name 10 women artists off the top of my head? And I couldn't. And so I thought, okay, let's kind of put that, enthusiasm and what do we have around us? I don't have an audience. I don't have a book. I don't have a podcast or a newspaper column. I've got Instagram. So start something that you can always do. I sort of talk about that and How to Live an Artful Life. It's full of encouragements and prompts and advice and how to sort of kickstart things. And I think, starting, you never know what something's going to become. I still do The Great Woman Artist every single day. I posted this morning about the treasures I found at the NGA in DC, and the day before was the Carol Bove at the Guggenheim. And, I think that it's just it's almost like a diary for me. And with The Story of Art Without Men, it was, again, because years ago, the Tate Modern asked me to install a giant 10-meter high timeline of the last 1,000 years of women artists, as they do. And I went to my Gombrich Story of Art, which was my introductory Bible to art history. That was my book when I was a teenager. I got it for Christmas one year, and it's the book you get for Christmas if you love art history as a teenager. And I went to that book to look at its timeline at the back. And I just remember sort of flicking the page and turning another page and realizing that he didn't include a single woman artist. And actually, just like he kind of left out women, I thought I'd leave out men in so many ways. And the goal, of course, is not to have a history of art without men. It's to say that we need to address what is happening, what has happened with scholarship in the past. And often people don't notice that. So actually almost have a kind of Guerrilla Girls approach to it, which is to have these kind of bold text, play with history and what we've been taught and actually show us that it actually isn't quite what it seems. And so I think people are always quite startled by the title. But then I say, well, the story of art was essentially the story of art without women. And so, it was just great fun. I mean, who doesn't have fun learning about the lives of artists? So it was, to be honest, it was a joy.
And who better than a woman to reinscribe the stories of women in where they belong, right? And the book really launched you into the literary arena as a formidable and really cool and fun art historian, very popular. And I think it really made your readership harken in on this spotlight on non-male artists alone. So what is your hope with your second book? What do you think? What do you hope this book will do?
Well, it's really interesting. I've been working on another book for the last 4 or 5 years, maybe. And that book, it actually must be about the last 4 years, because I started writing it when this was published. And I had this sort of, the book did really well in the UK and people were sort of excited, and that was obviously wonderful. But there was this whole, what are you going to do next? What are you going to do next? Is it going to be as good as this? And it was sort of really anxiety inducing in lots of ways. And 2023 was great because I came to America and it was a success. And then 2024 was kind of this quite dark year where I was really anxious about writing the next book. And actually, it's not really about that. It's not about producing a work that's going to do well. It's about producing what matters to you. And in the middle of writing the book, I actually I know it's sort of slightly psychotic, procrastinated by writing another book. But in a way, I wanted to also write something that lifted me out of this quite dark place and remind myself of why I do what I do, why we all love art, why it's the making that is the necessary thing. It is the touching, it is the looking, it is the discussing. Like even today, we've had an electric afternoon learning about so many artists. And that's what it's about. It's about sort of scavenging and again, lifting people out of that. And so in a way, it was kind of for that as well. And also to, like this book, I always say to all my audiences or readers, you don't have to have stepped inside a museum to read this book. I have no judgment. Whatever knowledge of art history you have, just come on in. It's such a fantastic party. And with this book, the format of each page is a kind of title for each date. Then it's a quote by the artist, and then I respond to it as a way for that quote to apply to my reader's life. Maybe they're a lawyer or a banker, or they work in a supermarket or a hairdresser or an artist. It's for, I hope, absolutely everyone, because I firmly believe that everyone can be touched by art. And I'm sure in the Miami Design District, it is totally at the heart of everyone's life. But where I live in London, it isn't often necessarily the case. And often people say to me, art it's kind of over there. It's not my thing. And I say, trust me, we've got today's quote is by Ruth Asawa, who talks about, art will make a person broader. It will make a person wider. It will enhance whatever profession a person goes in to do. And actually, we need that kind of creative thinking in order to have rational thoughts. I would hope that politicians would look more at art, because art can do so much for us. It can teach us about the person's perspective on that side. It can, scientifically proven, calm our heart rate down. It can, what it can also do is it can invite us to this expanse of beauty that people have made. It shows us the capabilities of the human imagination, which in a world where, AI is turning us into soulless beings more than we can realize, reminds us of what we can do and what our hands can do and the joy of that. So that's a very long-winded way of answering your question, but really, it was to lift me out of something. And I really hope that it lifts other people out of things, or whatever they're doing. There's a quote by Hilton Als in the book. He talks about, it's our duty to share knowledge if we have it. And why wouldn't you? It's a party, basically. And everyone's invited.
Since you mentioned Hilton Als, I was hoping you could address a little bit the editorial decision behind this book was to include male artists and thinkers. So there's Hilton Als, there's Jerry Saltz, Felix Gonzalez Torres, James Baldwin. Can you tell us a bit how you arrived at that decision?
I know, shocking. 15 men out of 366. The thing is, my work is, of course, it's to celebrate women, but also it's to celebrate everyone. And actually, this book is the story of art without men. It's not how to live an artful life without men. And I also interview men for my podcast, and I want that perspective. I want everyone to feel like they could be part of it. And actually, Hilton Als, one of the greatest writers, a theatre critic for the New Yorker, he taught me about Alice Neel, who was the artist who really was the kind of impetus behind my entire project. You know, Alice Neal being this amazing painter of people who lived from 1900 to 1984. And he has curated the most beautiful exhibitions of hers. And because he talks about being a young kid growing up in Crown Heights and feeling like, oh, someone has seen my story. I'm allowed into this space. You know, people like me are immortalized in portraiture. And that's what it's about. It's about, you know, getting everyone involved. And we were saying earlier today, you know, I, especially when I'm teaching kids, because of the recent kids book in schools, I say, you know, life would be boring if you had to eat the same thing every single night. You know, you want to get Indian, you want to get Mexican, you want to get Chinese, like all these different things. The world is so much richer with different voices in it. And so, you know, I want that perspective. Charlie Porter, one of the greatest writers if anyone's read, I urge you to stock him or read him. His first book was What Artists Wear, which looked at artists through the lens of how they dress. His second book was about the philosophy of fashioning, looking at the Bloomsbury Group, who are sort of Virginia Woolf and Vanessa Bell, etc. His third book is an amazing novel. And, you know, I love to just talk to as many people as possible about art. And so
it's not about exclusion.
Exactly.
Let's talk about your podcast a little more. You've assembled a really incredible oral history archive with your podcast, The Great Women Artists, which is now on its 175th episode. I could highlight a handful of my favorite episodes, but I'd love it if we could all maybe mention what episodes you remember from the podcast. Many of us in this room have sent each other links to your newest episode as they come out, or older episodes as we become curious in different artists for different reasons, which brings me to my next question. We tend to think of art history as this area of study that is preoccupied with grand theoretical questions, right? And I think your communication style and the format of your information has really come to debunk that. We're obviously standing on the shoulders of giants when it comes to a feminist perspective on art history. But I think your standout contribution to this legacy has to do with a sort of democratization of art history, where you're having an approach to art and artists that makes the content not only accessible, because it's a free podcast and anyone can hear it wherever and whenever, but it's also fun. So I was telling you today, you've made art history like the coolest thing on earth. Is this something that is front of mind in your practice?
I think, you know, why do we go to books, or why do we go to podcasts or artists? We go because we want to hear that person's voice. And, you know, right at the end of the book, there's a sort of section from like sort of December 26th to 29th where I talk about that. Louise Bourgeois has a great quote about, you know, as an artist or as a person, you have to be a sort of glass box. Celia Poole talks about this idea of sort of shunning embarrassment. Don't let embarrassment or that kind of fear put you off. And I think that, you know, a book that really changed my life was called The Lonely City by Olivia Laing. I urge you all to read it. And when I was younger, I was studying art history at university. And, you know, I struggled a little bit with the academic side. I'm so respectful of people who are in the academic field. I interview them the whole time. I read them the whole time. But, in terms of my sort of personal way of writing, I couldn't sort of break through. And when I read The Lonely City by Olivia Laing, something just sort of switched. She wrote about art through the lens of loneliness and sort of biography, but also her biography. So she wrote about, you know, Andy Warhol through loneliness, David Wojnarowicz, Zoe Leonard, Edward Hopper. And suddenly I saw these artists in a completely different way. And I thought, oh, it's actually, as a writer or a communicator, it's up to you to actually find your voice in lots of ways. And the Instagram was great for that, because at first I was so nervous about writing these posts. I mean, luckily I had 0 followers, so it was fine. But it also allowed me, do not to go back to the beginning. It allowed me to find my voice in lots of ways. And same with, I guess, the podcast. So I guess I just chat to people as hopefully who I am. But also I think that it is at the front of my mind, because again, art history, I don't know about around here, but in England, it's mainly taught at private schools. Art history has this kind of, you know, state sort of, people think that it's sort of for certain people only. And it's just not true, because art is for everyone. Again, I've been going to kids' schools and saying, hands up if you're into art, if you're into sport, hands up if you're into climate awareness, hands up if you're into reading. And I say there's art about all those things. So if your friends say they're not into art, just tell them what I've told you, because there is art for everyone. And so, I really I want to make it exciting for everyone. But also, so much of the time, why I also started it was because, a few reasons, but one of them was because, lots of people were saying, oh, that artist is so great. Oh, she's so great. And I'd be like, well, why? And so I hope it gives people the why. It delves into this art that can feel quite maybe conceptual or just, I don't know, distant. And then I hope to sort of bring it to the forefront. And by the end of the episode, you think, okay, I feel something from that now.
In the final chapter of The Story of Art Without Men, you write that today, and I quote, "Today the world seems to be moving faster than it's turning," which perfectly captures this feeling of acceleration and exhaustion we all feel in a world that is inundated with images and really challenged, I think, by the new image making technologies, like you were saying, AI and whatnot. What can art history do to save us from this feeling?
I think art history can teach us about time. There's a great quote in How to Live an Artful Life from Naomi Beckwith, who's the chief curator of the Guggenheim. And I remember saying, I interviewed her on Singen and Goody for the podcast, and she talked about this idea of museums being places of deep time and us to kind of reflect, why do we go to these? Why have temples preserved these relics for thousands of years, hundreds of years, tens of years? And I think that, when we appreciate something, or we can understand the kind of preciousness of it, the sacredness of it. There's another great quote by Sally Mann, which talks about, remembering that everything is beautiful, is alive. And actually that can teach us whether it's, people or a plant or something, I don't know, actually to appreciate something's beauty in so many ways. And art history can be that vehicle for that. But also I think that art history can invite us in so many different ways of looking. So another work that I've got in the kids' book is an amazing painting from the 1600s by Clara Peters. And it's this sort of Flemish still life painter. And what looks at first like it's, a sort of beautiful still life with chains and shells and coins and just beautifully executed. I say to the kids, it's actually a self-portrait. And they go, what? Why is that a self-portrait? Okay, look closely at the right goblet and you'll find up to 10 self-portraits hidden in the reflection. And I think that's also something, and we all look as a sort of communion. We will be so excited by something together. It's that kind of chemical reaction. So in relation to your question, sorry, it's probably very off-piste, but that's what art history can do. It can just get us to look a bit further. And I think that can kind of ground us. And I don't know, I go to museums every day of my life, and to look at art with someone, to debate it and to discuss it is just a fantastic way of spending time and really being present. I think maybe that's it. It can teach us about being present.
Absolutely, I agree. We will open it up to questions in a second, because I know this room is full of questions. But I was hoping before that you could tell us a little bit about the book you're working on next, because clearly you have not been writing enough books. Do you have a fourth book in the making? What's that about?
I do. And as I said, I've been working on it for years, and I basically had to learn classics in the Bible because of it. And I'm allowed to talk about it because I've been lecturing about it. My process in many ways is to write. When I want to sort of try and grapple with these big subjects, I will write a column about it, and then I'll do a talk about it. And then I'll be like, okay, now you can write a chapter on it, because there's something so daunting about writing something long form in so many ways. This book was actually born out of a lecture that I gave. And so I'm very inspired by a book called Ways of Seeing by John Berger, which was a book that was written in 1972. And he has this great line that I always think about. It sums everything up for me in art history, which is men act and women appear. And so my question is, because in his prologue, he says his aim with Ways of Seeing is to begin a process of questioning. And that's what I love about John Berger. He gets you to question everything, and he gives you permission to question everything, which I think actually is the heart of everything. And so I want to question him in the sense that, what happens when women act and women appear? how do we see now? So this new book essentially takes, each chapter is based around a subject. So it could be the Virgin Mary, Eve, Lilith, Medusa, Venus, witches, Mary Magdalene, etc., etc., Salome, Judith, etc. And it goes back to the sort of original stories of these figures. It looks at how they were portrayed by the old masters, which might have perpetuated a certain narrative and might be slightly disconnected to the original story. And then actually, if we see them from a female artist's perspective, how do we see now? And it's really interesting because, I think it sort of teaches us about how we've been fed to think of these certain figures, which are still very much ingrained in society, whether we think about pop culture or the media or something. Eve, it's such a fascinating subject. But then what happens when, Wangechi Mutu depicts Eve, or Leonora Carrington? Suddenly you see it in a completely different way. And what if those were the dominant narratives? And also, I'm such a believer in not censoring anything at all. I want to have a conversation with the past, and I want to have a conversation with all art. And actually, it's just to say, well, what if we just add that perspective? It might actually enrich what we see. And it's the same with, my work with women artists. It's totally not to ban men from anything. It's just to say, well, what if we just add this? It might be actually really exciting, and more people might feel like they can be part of it. So it's all about kind of expanding perspectives. And it's so fascinating. It was just Easter, and sorry, I've become obsessed with the figure of Mary Magdalene. Everywhere I look, I'm like, that's not the real story. I go around the Raphael exhibition. People are like, oh my God, this woman needs to calm down. But it does sort of, you think, oh my God, I thought that, this was the sort of truth. And it's sort of amazing, the kind of disconnect between the text and the image. So that's my kind of next step.
Amazing. Well, if anyone doesn't know this, Katy is lecturing in Palm Beach on Friday at the Northern Museum of Art. So let's all take the train up to Palm Beach and continue this conversation. I'd love to open it up to questions now. If anyone has any comments for Katy, don't be shy.
Or if anyone's got any favorite artists they want to tell me about.
All the artists in the room, raise your hands.
That book coming out?
Oh gosh, I have written sort of a few drafts, but maybe September 2027. I have written a lot, but the thing is, it's a bit like the story of Art Without Men. When I got the deal for it, my proposal looked completely different, and we were in conversation today. The more you travel, the more you speak to people, the more you think, oh my God, these are the biggest. You actually have to travel the world to see so much of it, and you're accumulating all this information the whole time. And so I'm still kind of learning and picking things up. And I think, my God, I'm going to add that to that, and I'm going to add that to that. At one point, my editor just has to go, stop. So that's when it will come out.
I thought it was so interesting when you mentioned today that for the Brazilian edition of The Story of Art Without Men, the Brazilian editors asked you to include more Brazilian artists, right? And that edition in Portuguese is actually one of the biggest selling translations of The Story of Art Without Men. So that's an example of how a book evolves over time, but also how a book is always sort of incomplete.
Oh my God, totally. And I think, when I look at this book, I sort of can't look at it anymore because it's just full of ghosts. It's such a fraction of a fraction of a fraction. And I say this in the book, it's not the story of Art Without Men. It's a story of art without men. And it was my take when I wrote it a few years ago. And that's kind of why I do the podcast and the Instagram, so I can keep going and keep finding these things and bring people along the way.
Amazing. There's a question in the back.
Your newest book, How to Live an Artful Life, how do you think it changed how you go about your process and your life as an artist?
That's such a good question. For those who didn't hear, she asked how to live an artful life changed the way my process. In so many ways, I think it's given me permission for so many different ways of thinking and experiencing and working. Oftentimes, when I think of a writer, someone writing a book, you have to be isolated and in a library or at a desk the whole time. But there's a great quote from Patricia Highsmith, who wrote the Ripley novels on, I think it's January the 17th. And she talks about this idea of sort of getting into the right frame of mind. And her process was to make working as pleasurable for herself as possible. So she would work from bed. She would be surrounded by cigarettes and ashtray, donuts, etc., etc. And while I don't necessarily have that, it just says, actually, you don't have to have this grand idea of what an artist or a writer can be. I think there's a great quote from Christina Camise, who's a brilliant British artist, who talks about, just showing up to work. And maybe you only get those 2 magic hours a day, but sometimes you have to show up in order to get that. And it's just, I think what writing this book did for me was it reminded me of all the kind of struggles, but it's so worth it. What is it that we're all striving for? And it is just this continuous line. And also I think it's, again, like I said, it's a way of looking at the world in a kind of more beautiful way. And again, I think time is such an interesting one. And knowing that you're always on your own time, it's taught me a lot about competitivity. We think, oh my God, that person's doing that over there. And actually that's about celebrating those people and thinking, well, this is how I'm going to do it. Because again, if all of our lives were the same, it would be really dull. And so I think it's taught me about the sort of always looking at something in a kind of more hopeful way.
Yes, Salome.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. I so admire your work.
Oh, thank you so much.
I'm wondering, you've come such a long way probably from not being able to name 10 women artists, and you probably just see art through womanhood a lot of the time. Are there any other markers of identity that you found yourself fixated on, as you go on, nationality or race, or is it just women for you? Do you try to bring an intersectional look into it at times? Or, you're already doing so much by touching on the point of women, but like you said, it's a fraction of a fraction of a fraction. So what are other categories that you're interested in?
I look at all art. There's no restriction in terms of race, sexuality, background, class, but also medium, textile, architecture, design, whatever, video, etc. It's been really interesting going into schools and in the UK, I've been into a primary school every single day in March. Quite relieved to come to the US. And as much as I love 9-year-olds. But, I'm very conscious because I've had to speak to a lot of boys' schools as well. And, it's a tricky time. And the last thing I want to do is make them feel excluded. And so really the talks are centered around art and why art and how it's for everyone and how there are so many different ways of making it. And it's so wonderful. And, again, like I said, if you're into sport, there's art about that, etc. And then at the end of that talk, I say, but I noticed something. And actually the message of this book and for my work and what I want you to take away is, if you see something that's missing, do something about it. Tell your teacher, make a mini exhibition on your classroom wall. Do something in your vicinity that you can do that. And so I think because I have that mentality, I sort of also, I do that naturally as well. I think also I question myself, maybe I've gone a bit this way. I've concentrated on too many artists who might be from here. I need to go over here. So I'll either travel or I'll speak to artists or I'll research or whatever. But I think it is always, just reminding myself to check myself. Because again, you, for example, about a year ago or something, I really wanted to learn more about historical artists. And I feel like I've slightly sort of scratched that itch in lots of ways because, I want that kind of more foundational, knowledge, etc. So I think it's just, and you kind of know when you're coming, not to an end of something, but you think, oh, actually, I haven't concentrated on this for a while. But I think I am always, checking myself and making sure that I'm looking at from a wide range perspective.
Yes.
Do you have a favorite museum?
I love that.
Do I have a favorite museum? Well, oh gosh, how long have you got? My favorite place in the world is not necessarily a museum, but a sculpture park. And it's by an artist called Niki de Saint-Phal, who's a French-American artist who made these kind of bulbous, exactly, the Tarot Garden in Tuscany. And, she spent 25 years making this. She went to Park Güell, Gaudi's Park Güell in 1955 and said, I want to make a living sculpture park. And it's just this paradise and wonderment of the kind of human imagination. And it's a live-in sculpture park. So for example, she has, I think it's the high priestess, is this very kind of voluptuous woman with giant breasts, and in one breast she has a working kitchen and the other one's a bedroom, and it's amazing. And it's extraordinary. And when you enter through the woman through her back, it's shards of mirrored glass, this whole sort of expanse, which is a kitchen and a dining room. And that's my favorite place in the world. I want my ashes scattered there. But my God, another thing I love as well is artists' houses. So I've been lucky enough to visit Leonora Carrington's and Louise Bourgeois', and I'm a trustee at Charleston, which is the former home of the Bloomsbury Group in the UK. And again, to sort of walk where artists walk and to sort of feel their presence. That's something that I love as well. But in terms of favorite museum, which is your original question, maybe the Met. I was in New York for 3 days and I went twice, so that probably sums it up.
Nina?
Okay, so same. So we are part of the Collective 62. We are the first women run space in Miami. So my question is, do you think categorizing ourselves as all women running a space helps, or sometimes hinder the idea of how they perceive our work, the artists remember, like when you categorize yourself?
It's such an interesting question, and I have sort of many answers to this. Sometimes those spaces are necessary. That's the thing. So, for example, I don't want to necessarily have to have written this book that is just focused on women artists, but sadly, it is necessary because I wanted to contribute something, like you probably do as well, that actually spotlights that. Because, for example, where I live in London, the London's National Gallery is just 1% of its collection is dedicated to women artists. We go to museums to learn, but if we're not seeing art by a wide range of people, then we're not seeing society. And actually, those spaces have to exist. I was just at the National Museum of Women in the Arts in DC, and this was the first museum that gave Rose Wiley, who's a fantastic British painter who's 94 years old, her first museum exhibition. Now she has an exhibition at the Royal Academy, but she was never kind of given that space. So sometimes these spaces are necessary to champion these artists. Of course, there's also the debate of, will as many people go to them, or should the National Gallery should that work be in the National Gallery or more people see it? Well, the thing is, the National Gallery might not have been looking, and do you know what I mean? So it's like they have to, these spaces had to exist because of institutions like that didn't bother to look outside of them. But I sadly, in the world that we exist in now, I do think it's necessary still. Because they are spaces that people can go to to seek sort of alternative ideas. But of course, the goal in the future is for there to be an equal, harmonious world. If that will ever happen, I don't know. What do you think?
I feel that in our case, it started more like a middle age, and then we were able to welcome all ages. But as a middle-aged woman, I wanted to have a space where all the women can join and be in that conversation. Because contemporary art sometimes can be a little bit mean with when you're crossing the 50s. Not cool. Miami sometimes is very fresh and everything is upcoming. And sometimes you don't feel that way. So after you raise your kids are going out for college, and finally you have the time and maybe the money to pay for a studio, then you're not accepted in a community because, I don't know. So that was my goal. But it was intuitive, and we all follow. We're like 16 women all around. That's amazing. Yeah, we're still here.
But I mean, I'm lucky enough to curate exhibitions at museums now. But my first ever exhibition was in a foyer of an advertising agency because I didn't have access to a museum or whatever. So it's like sometimes you have to. I don't know. I think the best thing you can do is just bring communities together and put on exhibitions and create these spaces. Because you never also know what they're going to turn into, or who's going to come through the door, or what the future of them will be. Thank you.
It's so interesting because a lot of non-male artists don't want to be defined as a non-male artist as opposed to artists who are understood to be male artists. So the question of whether women artists need the clarification that they're women before they're artists is, it's good that a question like that comes up.
Definitely.
Any other questions? Yes.
In your opinion, what is the most relevant female artist in history?
Most relevant. Got a whole book about it. But, someone who I love, not that she is the most relevant, but I think one of the most defiant, who I just think, how the hell did you do it, was Artemisia Gentileschi, who was an amazing painter who was born in 1593 in Rome. And she lived until about 1652. And, she signed and dated her first work, Susanna and the Elders, which is a really famous biblical tale that's often, she signed it when she was just 17. And this is a story that often is painted by artists in history because it allows for the semi-naked Susanna. And it's actually quite a sort of dark scene because it's of a woman who's bathing in her garden when two lecherous men try and seduce her. But oftentimes it's kind of like, sensual and whatever. And what Artemisia does is she shows Susanna's perspective. She shows the woman's perspective. And that's what she does with the Judith story or the Virgin Mary story or the St. Catherine story. And so I think that's extraordinary because you can see a woman who was working 400 years ago and you can see that she saw the world like us. And, our perspective is so minimized in art history to kind of see someone who's just saying how it is. I think that makes her relevant. I was at the National Gallery of DC yesterday purposefully to see the Mary Magdalene. And it's this extraordinary painting that doesn't sexualize or sensationalize her. It shows her for who she is. And so I think she's very relevant. Thanks.
Yes.
So this question brings me back to Nina. I'm also part of the collective. And a woman would never ask this question. And that is why a female collective is so important, because we don't necessarily think that competitive. And I really appreciate the safe haven that we have created here for ourselves, because there's not this competitive thought. It's not which sperm hits the egg first, but what I wanted to ask you is, I really appreciate the sophistication you're bringing into the discourse, and that you then go back and teach children. And what brought you to that route?
I think, so much of the mission is to invite everyone to this subject and just to kind of marvel at the creative geniuses that have been in our world before, and to help people understand art history, and to let people, where I live in England, museums are free. So it's sort of the most democratic thing in so many different ways. And so how do we get people into it? Well, the people who you need to target are those who are going to be the leaders of the future. And so I think children was the next step, because again, I want to reach everyone and anyone. But I think that to sort of educate them and to kind of feel like they can be part of it from an early age when their brains haven't even formed is so important. Also, again, this book is sort of highly interactive, the kids' book. So there are art tasks on every page, on every chapter. So, for example, if I teach kids about Yoko Ono, I'm saying, I want to encourage them to make their own wish trees. Or if I'm talking about Joan Mitchell, I talk about her friendship with James Schuyler, the poet, and saying, well, you can do that too. If your friend writes a poem and you can draw a pastel because of it, or vice versa, you can be like this artist as well. And I think, when I talk about this actually in How to Live an Artful Life, one of my favorite interviewees for the podcast is Elif, who's an amazing novelist, a French novelist who lives in England. Urge everyone to read her books. And, she goes into schools and she says when she asks the kids when they're 6 or 7, hands up if you want to be an artist, everyone puts their hands up. And she does the same thing when people are sort of 15 or 16 and no one does. And so what is it in that kind of, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 sort of age bracket that somehow these sparks kind of go out? And actually, I sort of want to encourage kids that, again, if you want to go into politics, like know about art and think artistically, think like an artist. What would that artist do? And so it's for many reasons, and it's just been a joy because kids are so inventive and perceptive. I say You know, I always ask the kids, if you had some paints or pencils or clay, what would you make? And they all come up with all different ideas. And one girl the other day said to me, who was 10, I'd make a heart out of clay, but I'd put a bandage around it because lots of things have been happening in my life. And I just thought, my God, actually just to give kids the space to say that and say that out loud. And I just think, that kid is so perceptive and give people agency. It can show them that their opinion matters. And so it's that as well.
Yes, Dominique.
In the story of Art Without Men, you talk about how all these female artists become artists thanks to the opportunities, contexts, environments that they are born into. How has your upbringing and context brought you to do what you do?
Great question. I think that I feel so lucky to have been brought up in London and the UK, where museums are free. I think that's the kind of heart of it. The way I got into art was I had a big sister, who's 9 years older than me. I'm youngest of 4 kids, and I just worshipped my sisters, and I still worship them today. And when I was a kid, all I wanted to do was copy them. And so my elder sister was really into art history, and she used to bring me to museums, and I just thought that she was the coolest person ever. So I've just carried on doing that my whole life. And actually, but I love that because I had an education that was so non-prescriptive. It was so, you should think that. That's the way you have to look at it. It was so like, be thrown into the turbine hall at Tate Modern when you're 6 and just run around, essentially. And I think that sort of sense of play and, again, when your mind hasn't formed and you don't have to have an opinion of something or you have to have knowledge about something, it's that kind of excitement that I think I'm very grateful for. And again, because I lived in London, so I could do internships easily, and I could get contacts through that, and I could live at home and I could work. And so I had so many advantages in that way. But also my parents they like art, but they're like probably more into sort of old masters. But again, I think that was kind of good because with my mum, for example, my process is that I always read my books aloud to her, poor thing. And, but she'll always say, well, what does that mean? Like, why are you talking about it like that? So actually to kind of cut the jargon from a mum who was just like, what are you talking about? I think that's also quite handy. So I think use every advantage or whatever that you have.
Anyone else? We'll take one last question. No?
It's kind of a slightly weird question, actually. When you're talking about the history of art, I feel like most people talk about the time from Christianity onwards, but aren't there cultures from before that celebrated the female figure, the female fertility goddess? And were the people making that art, do we know whether they were men or women? Or, I did read your book, but it's been a while.
Don't worry at all.
I can't quote you.
No, it's fine. It's a really interesting question. This book only sort of spans the last 500 years, but the Minoans, it's thought that women made those extraordinary sort of frescoes. Similarly, the Cycladic figures from the Cyclade Islands, we don't know who made them, but they celebrate the female form in such an extraordinary way. It's so tricky. I talk to sort of classicists and archaeologists the whole time about, was this made by a woman? And they don't really know. But I think there definitely were different approaches to the female form in a more sort of celebratory way than objectified way. And, when Christianity does sort of enter in the 4th century, the sort of the nudity changes so much. It kind of gets wrapped up in shame rather than kind of celebration of fertility. And it's very kind of interesting how different civilizations, certainly Western civilizations, have also glorified certain pasts and then sort of adopted what they want from that in order to create something. So for example, like the Renaissance, revitalizing the ancient world, but actually doing that from how they wanted to interpret it rather than actually perhaps not what the Greeks really thought about something. So for example, like Aphrodite and Venus, Aphrodite being the sort of Greek goddess of love and sex, and her being a sort of, you pray to her to be fertile, or you pray to her for love. Sappho, amazing poetry, being like, I'm so heartbroken, help me find my way or whatever. And then suddenly fast forward 1600 years, she becomes this objectified, passive, silent, sexualized figure. And you think, what happened to the sort of divine aspect of that? So I think that's very interesting.
And the politicization of those characters to keep women kind of under the...
Well, you think about someone like Medusa as well, who was originally a sort of protector and someone who would, ward off evil. And because she, in a sort of protective way, people would put her on amulets or their door frames. And then somehow she kind of morphed into this woman who people should be feared of. And suddenly the unofficial campaign for Trump in 2016 is Trump holding up Hillary's head as if it was Medusa. And you think, okay, this is kind of odd. But I think it's good to question that and actually think, well, what if a woman interpreted it? How might they see? We were talking about Hélène Cixous's essay, The Laugh of the Medusa, which is a fantastic approach to it, which ends, she's beautiful and she's laughing. And I think that, anyway, this is probably, I'll tell you afterwards. But anyway, great question. I'll go on for too long. We'll be here all night.
Well, I invite everyone to stay around, have a drink, stay with us, stay with Katy, who will be on her way to Palm Beach later tonight. Grab a copy of either of her books and have Katy sign them while she's here with us.
Thank you
Katy.
so much. Thank you. Amazing.